Welcome to Solutions Rising. I'm Rachel Branch, and I am so pleased, really pleased, and honored to welcome author and attorney Susan Mills to our program. And I'm quoting, Susan Mills was an immigration attorney for over 20 years and prepared thousands of asylum cases for Central American immigrants. We're going to have quite a conversation on this program. Welcome, Attorney Mills. Susan, if I may call you.
Please,
Susan.
yes, thank you.
Okay.
And thank you so much for having me.
You are so welcome. And would you please, I always start out and say, whatever you're comfortable with, would you please talk about your background, your heritage, a
Sure.
little about yourself?
I was born and mostly raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and my mother was an activist in the civil rights movement, so that was sort of my early background. My mother always gave us the idea that social change was the purpose of life, the only meaning of life. So she was active as a young child in that, and when I was in high school, she was very involved in prisoner rights issues. My brother, a little older than me, was sort of born to be a lawyer, and has for many years been a civil rights lawyer, largely involved in defending prisoner rights, class action suits.
That's
So
terrific.
Right, so that's my background, very much involved in social change. For myself, I started out sort of as a lesbian, feminist, anarchist. I was very much involved in sort of the idea of creating alternative culture. As I got older, I went to Nicaragua during the Sandinista period, got interested in Central American issues, came back and worked in the sanctuary movement a little bit in the United States. I ended up helping to resettle a couple of people from Central America to Providence, Rhode Island, where I lived. Ended up getting involved with a Salvadoran refugee who became my son's father. Finally went to law school myself and represented a lot of Central Americans, but people also from around the world. I spoke Spanish at that point, so I was very connected to Latin Americans. But many asylum cases, many unaccompanied minors, kids who have been abused, neglected, abandoned by one parent or another, all of which is very much inspirational for my book. So I was an attorney for 20 years or so and retired about 5 years ago, and partly in order to take all the stories that had been swirling around in my mind and occupying my emotions and put them into some creative form. I had always wanted to write fiction since I was 8 years old and had no idea if I would actually be able to, but ended up writing this book, On the Wings of a Hummingbird.
Where'd you go to law school?
I went to Northeastern Law School, so I was commuting from Providence to Boston with a young child at the time.
It's wonderful. And you're talking about the era of, I've always been a person who's cared about the underdog and the most vulnerable, and this is, of course, you're part of a program that is dear to my heart. Of course, the children and what is going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
For our audience, Susan Mills and I met at my favorite restaurant in Bridgeport, Connecticut called Blood Roux. And this was how I learned about her book, On the Wings of a Hummingbird. And I must say, you cannot be involved, I would expect that you cannot be involved with all those asylum cases and not just love the people that you're working with and become so close to them. And I'd like to hear a little bit about how you happened to write this book, but I'm sure the stories must have just, if you wanted to write since you were 8 years old, the stories must just have been prominent in your mind.
They were. I would say, it was such a combination of all the stories that really inspired the book. But there was one girl in particular. She was 15 years old, as my character is also 15 years old. But she had come from Guatemala, and her mother was in the United States, but she didn't tell her mother before she left, and she didn't tell her grandparents that she was leaving before she left her home. So she came all by herself, 15 years old. When she got across the border, she did call her mother and ended up living with her mother. But she was somewhat, obviously she was very independent, sort of fiercely independent young woman, and very unusual for a Central American girl. She had short hair, which is unusual for Central American girls. She loved to play soccer, and she was just very independent. And her case was not particularly out of the ordinary, but just the image of her really inspired me with Petra in my book, who's also sort of fiercely independent and breaking out of some of the Latin American stereotypes for women.
Is Petra a composite of
Absolutely.
different children? Or
I mean, also including
particularly
myself.
One? Oh,
It was, it's, sure, she was inspired by that girl, but as the book came along, it was, it got more complex and more imaginative, and I think you always put something of yourself, authors always put something of themselves in the book, so that's certainly there too.
And of course, this is so precious. I mean, what is going on today? I mean, the immigration policies, even now, as we're taping this program,
Right.
We haven't even begun to solve the immigration problems. And if you care about children and babies, I mean, what has gone on at the border, and this book is very, very important in highlighting the need for, as you know, the need for taking care of children.
Right. And yeah, children
stopping
become
you.
adults, so it doesn't end when they become adults. But yeah, I mean, kids, obviously under the Trump administration, the immigrant kids had a horrific time. I think when I think about what should be done about immigration in general, I sort of reach obstacles. It's a very complicated, complex problem. I suspect that borders are more the problem or more the cause of the problem than the immigrants. That immigration is just, there's something almost inevitable about it. But I was happy that as a lawyer, my job really combined the global and the political and the personal. It was very much a one-on-one way of understanding, gaining some understanding of what's happening in the world. And I really appreciated that. Guatemala, for instance, which is where my book starts off, has been involved, now it's torn by gang violence, but it had decades and decades of civil war, horrible civil war. And that doesn't go away when the war's over. The violence, you think about how Trump policies affected the psychology of America, and that's not going away quickly, but decades and decades of violence affect the psychology of people. And
Of course.
so domestic violence, for instance, is a huge problem in Guatemala. Guatemala and some of the other countries in Central America are definitely among have the highest rates of femicide in the world, killings of women. So yeah, women are very much in danger. Children of all kinds are being recruited, of all kinds of male and female children are both being recruited by gangs all the time, and there's a lot of problems there. At the same time, Guatemala is a beautiful country. It's full of this amazing culture. The Mayan culture is unlike in so many places, has really survived as a full-blooded culture in
Will you talk
Guatemala.
a little bit about that culture?
Yeah. So that maybe is my weakest point, honestly, because as much as I knew so much about Guatemala and what was happening there, and I dealt with many people from Mayan ancestry, but we never talked about Mayan religion or Mayan cultural
And I don't think we ever learned much in our country about
indigenous,
well,
Sure.
indigenous people, including right here in our own country.
Right.
And I think, of course, that nameless former president we had to be, who really just exponentially pushed the hate and the unconscionable treatment in this country for separating babies from mothers. I mean, I can't even think about that.
Right.
And to think about a little girl like Petra, am I pronouncing
Yes,
it?
that's right, yeah.
Petra. Yeah, think about a little girl like that crossing a border, but by herself, and having the strength and the resilience and survive. I mean, I can't even imagine doing that.
I had 8-year-olds that crossed, clients who came across by themselves at 8, or even younger. I mean, maybe they have they meet somebody along the way who helps them, or a coyote or something helps them, but they're basically alone. Yeah, it's kids in a lot of circumstances grow up faster than they do in the United States.
Oh yes, yes.
So, but the Mayan thing, I purposely Petra is not Mayan herself. She has Mayan ancestry, and which definitely describes the majority of the population of Guatemala. Her mother flees from her husband, Petra's father, from the domestic violence situation to the United States when Petra's 5 years old, and she's being raised by her grandparents, and her grandfather in particular certainly was raised in more directly in Mayan culture, and he's passing along to her a lot of the Mayan stories, the mythology, which she uses really to explore her world and think about right and wrong and how to make a future of integrity despite the difficult circumstances she's living in.
I think the little bit I know about Mayan culture, I just remember seeing some monuments that kind of were like the Sphinx and the pyramids in Egypt. They are old,
yes,
historical. I mean, that's a place I would love to visit. And the culture does come down heritage-wise
right.
for these children. But how did the young people get to you? If you're in Providence, Rhode Island, were these people that sponsored these children? How did they get to you as an attorney?
Well, most of the time, kids who ended up in Providence, where my law office was, knew someone there. They had, if not a parent, some relative or close family friend, and then it was just a matter of people hearing about us, like most people, it's mostly word of mouth, how people heard about us, and the adult would bring them in and find, hopefully find out that there was. Sorry, at the border, usually most of these kids would be stopped at the border or present themselves. Like Petra presented herself voluntarily at the border, and then allowed to enter. But they're allowed to enter with a bunch of paperwork and a court date. So they know they have to do something, right? In general, so they come to us. What do we do now? And in many cases, they're eligible for this what's called special immigrant juvenile application, which is very helpful for young kids who come unaccompanied minors.
Now, these young children, I mean, we've seen all these pictures of the horrendous way that they're living in, like these camp kind of things. How long do they stay there, and how do they get out? I mean, they must have some court procedure where they get this paperwork so that they could get to you.
Right. So I have to say that a lot of that, the most detention of children has happened in the last 5 or 6 years.
Yes.
Since I retired. So.
Excuse me.
No,
yes.
no, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like it didn't happen before that, but I think
the unconscionable
the worst stuff happened after I left, and I was fortunately or unfortunately didn't get to help people in that situation. But my law office mostly dealt with the ones who managed to get out, and they would get out largely by applying for asylum, or the U.S. government is ultimately limited because it's very expensive. There were a lot of people coming across, and it's very expensive to detain them. So they had to let people out, either by sending them back if they could, or letting them go on and go through immigration court proceedings. And I think now and before Trump, there was a lot of pressure, sort of social pressure, media pressure to treat children better than other people. So they were released more often if they had relatives that they could go to.
So it seems like the really important thing is to have relatives that you can go to, or somebody that sponsors you, or somebody that knows you.
Right.
I'm so concerned about the children. I mean, isn't there several hundred that they haven't still found their parents to return?
Oh, it's hard.
I mean, this
that's
is
just the worst.
What that does to a kid. There are not words to describe how awful that is. So would the asylum, the legal work for the asylum, did it take a long time?
Asylum as everyone knows, is a very broken system in the United States. Most people who apply, there's different procedural ways that people get into the asylum system, but in many cases it just takes years to get through it. Even if you want to have your case heard quickly, it could easily take 3, 4, 5 years. If you lose, you appeal, and that takes another few years, and you can be here for years before it's all over.
Just personally, you could say it's not all right to ask this question, but I just am very curious, did it take an emotional toll on you, or how did you, I'm sure part of keeping your objectivity is knowing the necessity for the outcome for the child or the young
Yeah,
people. I
there
mean,
are-
20 years is a long time to work in that
It is.
specific area.
And almost every day you go in to hear the worst things that ever happened to people, and the gang rape, the massacres, and it can be as simple as just their families starving. People just don't come for no reason. They don't come because they don't want to be where they've always lived. They come because they're desperate. I sometimes use this quote from it's a song by Manu Chao. It says el hambre viene, el hombre se va. Hunger comes, the man leaves. It's just this. That's why people have always left. But often it's much worse than hunger.
And of course, I just don't understand so many people who are permeating this hate and racism and the rest of it, not understanding how frightened somebody must be to leave their home. I mean, if they would just sit down and think, what would it take for me to have to leave my home, to leave family, to leave friends,
Right.
to be so frightened?
I
And
tell you,
so-
one of the stories that stays with me the most of people that I dealt with was a man a Guatemalan man. He had come from Guatemala when he had 3 kids, but the third one was still in utero, so he never actually met the youngest one. He was here for about 15 years, something like that, fighting for his residence, which he finally got, and then his kids could join him. And when he came into my office, he was just crying from joy, surrounded by his kids. He had sent them money every week. He had called them almost every night or something. He was so close to his kids, but he'd never even met one of them, and the other 2 were very young. And just the pain, and then the joy, of reuniting, but the pain of family separation is.
And these are the
tremendous.
stories that have to be told, which is, I'm just so grateful that you
Yeah.
have.
So you
Come
asked how it
against.
affected me, and there's certainly a real thing called secondary trauma. I definitely lived. It's not the same as living through it, but I lived it secondarily by hearing my clients, and I always liked my clients, respected my clients, unlike some lawyers.
Yes. I've over 20 years in the law profession. I know what you're
Right.
talking about.
But yeah, so I mean, again, being able to get some distance on it, sort of really reflect on it, and think about it as a problem, as an issue, as I just, in the end, immigrants are one individual at a time. They're people
Yes.
with complicated pasts and complex emotions, and they just deserve our respect just like anybody else. In the end, I don't know what should happen about immigration in general, but I just feel like if we can just figure out how to treat people with respect and humanity, that would-
Compassion and love, and of course, one to one together.
Yeah.
If nothing else, they need to break down. Our government needs to break down the immigration to manageable and work on it. Not multitask, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah.
Spread it around. These people in Congress that are making so much and have no idea what it's like to be
Right.
without food, to be without a home. You break it down and you do the work. And
Yeah.
you do it on the legal front, you do it on the policy front, you do it any way you can. But I think this
Absolutely.
part of the problem is this.
I think a lot of
It's
it's just understanding and gaining
Yep.
empathy. And,
Yep.
Obama had a lot of interesting things to say, but he talked about reading as being a very central thing for him in developing his own point of view in the world,
Yep.
and how it taught him empathy and makes you live other people's lives that you wouldn't otherwise. And I agree. I think, books can be incredibly inspirational and informative.
And I admire you for your compassion and what you have done with your life in the treatment. And I would imagine that being able to write this novel and express, and you're educating at the same time, you're also able to take what you have lived, knowing all these people in such dire need, to put that in your book.
Yeah, and
And-
you know, I don't want to just talk about immigrants as people, victims in dire need. You know, they're people who are strong, and I mean, they have taken major steps to improve their lives, and they are, honestly, I don't want to sort of put anybody on a pedestal and make it unreal, but they are some of the best people I've ever known.
Yep.
My clients, they were, you know, Guatemalans and Central Americans are known for being humble, particularly those of Mayan ancestry. There's a lot of humility there, and they're, you know, they're only here because they're motivated to seek something better and want nothing else but to contribute and get ahead.
Yes, but one of the things I want to do is, and when I say coming from dire need, they obviously have had the resilience and the strength to
Right.
just keep going under insurmountable.
Right. You know, when I created the character Petra, I was very interested in not having her appear to be a victim. And as a teenager, she had a little bit of that thing that many teenagers are known for. Just I'm invulnerable. You know, nothing's going to harm me. Until
Oh yes, we could all remember those teenage years when we
Absolutely.
thought, wow, nothing's going to happen to us in life. We're just strong.
Right.
But I do want to quote one of the things I wrote was, we both know abuse occurs in all cultures and predominantly affects women and girls. And we can see Petra as vulnerable, just being an adolescent. Deborah DeBar, is that how you say her name?
DeBear, Deborah DeBear, yeah.
She's a senior deputy director, National Network to End Domestic Violence in Washington, D.C., wrote, quote, by weaving together the trauma of gender-based violence, the incredible clutches of Guatemalan gang violence, and the resilience of the human spirit, Susan Mills has proven herself to be an incredibly impactful storyteller. This is one of the most realistic renderings of the struggle to address trauma and abuse on an individual level that I have seen in my 35 plus years of work to end domestic and sexual violence. And I just think that's a beautiful quote.
That was a nice quote.
Yes.
Definitely.
About what you have created. And I just...
So let me just say that, you know, like I said, I was raised with a lot of my mother and my brother both being involved in prisoner rights, advocating for prisoners. And so I very much had, you know, Petra has a close childhood friend, Emilio, who ends up joining the gangs. Partly he's forced to a large extent. But he ends up also doing some pretty bad things, including killing their other close friend, Justina, who Petra was had just kissed shortly before he was killed. Much of the book is about her struggle with Emilio. You know, he poses a danger to her, and is part of the reason she ends up fleeing to the United States. But she is always thinking about whether that kind boy that she knew as a child isn't still inside him someplace. And she believes in the Christian concept of forgiveness for your enemies. People are forgiven for their sins. And she also sees the bitterness that it's left inside her as holding her back. So she's struggling with all of that. And you end up seeing how Emilio has been affected by this as well. And the book ends, Emilio also ends up coming to the United States and trying to start a new life. So they continue that struggle of reconciliation throughout the book. And in the end, there's hope, but continuing struggle, and things resolve, but not perfectly. And so it's just, when people come from Central America, we represented people who were abusers and people who were in the army, as well as representing people who were more obviously victims. And in some way, I think everyone's a victim. We all have our story, and we've all played it out in different ways. Anyway,
I'd like to diverge a little bit from that.
Yeah, sure.
From that, because a lot of people know where I've come from, and to put children in militias and violent gangs, and I mean, that is just horrific and unacceptable.
Of course, yeah.
And, I do believe in forgiveness, but I also believe that you do not forgive evil, and I do believe there's real evil in
But
the
then what
world.
happens to the kids who have been victimized and put in that situation? They grow up and do bad things.
Yep.
And what do you do with them?
You try to get through to them and
Yeah.
turn them around. But
it's the compassion. I mean, I think many people who
I
do
guess
bad
part
things,
of it, for me, I just say, who's ever committing that evil or atrocity, let them go to whatever creator, whatever they believe in, and ask for forgiveness. Don't come to victims and ask victims to,
Right.
victim survivors to forgive you. So that's kind
it's
of my...
definitely not a simple issue.
No,
Absolutely.
no.
I didn't mean to make it sound like
No, no,
Pitcher
of
just
course
forgave
not.
Emilio, and
Of course
no.
not. It's very complex, and
Absolutely.
you have done a stunning job. I'm just so grateful that you've been here. Applaud you for your book, and another way to stop the hateful rhetoric and unconscionable treatment of immigrants here and around the world. And as you said, you hope, quote, it will ultimately play some role in leading us toward a world where racism, sexism, and the othering of immigrants recedes, and where we can all acknowledge the simple humanity of immigrants. And all of our human rights require that each of us deserves respect, compassion, love, caring, and freedom from fear. And that most certainly includes a home and food.
Absolutely.
Final thoughts. We just have like a quick little minute, and I just want to thank you. I'm so grateful that you've agreed to be a guest on Solutions Rising. Susan Mills,
Thank you so much for
attorney and
inviting me.
author. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll give you just a little bit of time if you'd like one final comment. We want to mention your Kids in Need of Defense.
Right.
Please tell.
Right, so a portion of the sales of my book are going towards this group, which is known as KIND. It's a nonprofit which is fighting for rights for immigrant children, particularly that they all be represented in court if they're in removal proceedings. So you can make donations to that through my website, which is on the screen. And there's a button at the bottom of each page to make donations to KIND.
Wonderful.
It's a wonderful organization.
I really want to highlight that. Thank you so much. I'm very, very grateful. And if each one of us picked up one problem and solved it, imagine the incredible view we would all have of Solutions Rising. Thank you so much, attorney and author Susan Mills, for being a guest on Solutions Rising. And I hope each of our audience will find some way to be part of a solution, many solutions, whatever you are able to do. Thank you.